Van Diemen's Land in 1825 brought with it a number of challenges. Rough and sparsely populated, it was a hard life for most, but on this December night, in the woods outside of Launceston, an Englishman breathed in his freedom. Flanked by three fellow lifers, the men laughed at their success, a daring breakout from a Launceston watchhouse. This man, Thomas Jeffrey, would become one of the most notorious criminals in early Australian history, responsible for a string of depraved crimes that would be seared into the public consciousness, with his execution finally giving the young colony closure. Let's have a stab at this. Hi mates, and welcome to Something About Murder. I'm Jay Something, and every week I report on true crime from here in Australia. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and shoot the like button with your trusty boomstick, stab that subscribe button until it bleeds. Make sure you also punch the notification bell in the face so you can get notified every time we release a new video. Our videos are also available in audio form on Spotify or, whichever podcast platform is your favourite. We're going a fair way back this week, to the time of the colonies and the golden era of Australian bushrangers. This one, in particular, was a bit of a seasoned cannibal as well as a highwayman. Thomas Jeffrey was a native of Bristol, born in 1791. His father was a butcher. Jeffrey undertook 7 years at school and then pursued a career in the British Navy. After 4 years or so upon the warship Achilles, the harsh discipline of the Navy pushed him to abscond, which was not altogether uncommon at the time. He then did a 3-year stint in the army as a drummer, before absconding once again and giving the Navy another shot. This ended with him working on the frigate Leander, where he completed his run and returned to Bristol. However, Thomas discovered that he no longer fit in with his old mates back in Bristol. He was considered far too vulgar for the lads. His last trip with the Navy being a success, Thomas's father found him a new ship to work on, but Jeffrey ended up robbing the ship, and this was entirely frowned upon in the Bristol population, and so Thomas was even more of an outlier. Burning through his savings, Thomas Jeffrey ended up stealing from his father and other family throughout Bristol. He then travelled to London, where he lived with an uncle who owned a music shop. However, Thomas repaid his uncle's hospitality by conspiring to rob him of a considerable sum of money and goods, along with 2 accomplices. His mother's uncle, Captain Dower, was the next victim. Thomas managed to convince Dower that he was on the straight and narrow, and Dower offered him to join his ship, the Kingston of Jamaica. Jeffrey was even promised that he would be promoted to second mate on the next journey, all things going well. Dower bought Jeffrey a chest of clothing and other necessities, which Jeffrey promptly sold, and then the two men fell out. Thomas refused to sail with Dower and was given £3 to go back to Bristol. Instead, Thomas watched the Kingston of Jamaica leave port and promptly went back to Dower's house. Finding a servant girl watching the house, he informed her that he was injured and could not sail, and that Captain Dower had made him master of the house in his absence. Jeffrey promptly turned Dower's house into party central. Every night he'd be having big shindigs, becoming El Capitan of entertainment amongst his friends. Of course, it was never going to last, and on the day that Dower and his wife were due home, Jeffrey sent the servant girl on an errand and stripped the house of all of its valuables. He then caught a coach to Colchester and set himself up there. In Colchester, Thomas used what little money he had to live until he was basically begging for money on the streets. He called himself a castaway sailor and moved from parish to parish like a snake oil salesman, leaving when the locals wised up to his plans. Sometimes he claimed that he was from America, other times he was from the Isle of Man. To combat his need for money, he, along with 3 friends, became highwaymen, and they began to attack farmers on their way home from market. One day, an older farmer refused to hand over his hard-earned money, and one of Jeffrey's accomplices shot him dead. They stole £69 from the man, laid him in a ditch, and then travelled to a nearby pub where they drank and gambled until one of them became a little loose with their tongue. Authorities apprehended them on suspicion of murdering the old farmer, but they were released due to lack of evidence. Once released from police custody, Jeffrey bade farewell to his companions and went to try and get lodging with his sister, who ran a boarding school in Clifton. His sister, ashamed to have him as a brother, gave him £5 to leave. Thomas spent this quickly, falling back into his old habits. Eventually, Thomas found himself in Nottingham, once again being part of a motley crew of criminals. In Nottingham, the four men burgled a house, and then they split up into two pairs. One of the men was arrested days later, and Jeffrey promptly gave evidence against the others. Nonetheless, on trial in July 1817, Thomas Jeffrey was sentenced to transportation for life. He was quickly transferred to the prison hulk Retribution, before being assigned to the Prince Regent for transportation. His experience as a sailor stood him apart from the general rabble of convicts. In fact, the captain ordered his irons be struck off so he could work as one of the crew. But not just any member of the crew. No. Thomas Jeffrey accepted the role of flogger and executioner. Thomas landed at Port Jackson in Sydney in January 1820 and was quickly assigned to work alongside a settler named Brown on the Hawkesbury River. But his behaviour, or lack thereof, saw him handballed back to the authorities in Sydney. He was allocated a work party at Cockle Bay, west of Sydney, where he continuously stole oranges. This left him sentenced to 100 lashes, and 2 years in the coal mines of Newcastle. Eventually, of course, Jeffrey absconded from Limeburners Creek in the Hunter Valley and took to the bush with 6 other convicts. After a time, their supplies ran out, and 2 were killed and cannibalised by Thomas Jeffrey and eaten by the other convicts unknowingly. The flesh of the 2 convicts proved enough sustenance for the remaining men until they were apprehended in Parramatta. Thomas was sent over the Blue Mountains, where he promptly escaped again with 3 other convicts. On reaching Emu Plains, the 4 men began leaving a trail of robberies behind them, ending in 2 of the convicts giving themselves up to the police. Jeffrey then joined a gang called the Cow Pastures Mob, who were known to have nearly 30 men. These men were also highwaymen, continually robbing people and stores, until Jeffrey was banished from the group for his drinking, betrayed by 2 other companions, before being arrested once more and put in irons in Parramatta Jail. After some time, he asked to see John MacArthur, magistrate of the area, and proceeded to turn informant against the remaining Cow Pastures mob, resulting in their capture and Jeffrey being sent on a ship to Van Diemen's Land. He arrived in Port Dalrymple in 1822. Descriptions of the man at the time recall him being 5'9" with brown hair and brown eyes, tattoos of a castle, hearts, darts, flower pots and several other marks on his left arm. He was promptly sent to Georgetown Prisoners Barracks, where he soon climbed up the food chain and became a constable and overseer of the barracks. He would later brag that in his time as constable, the incidence of misbehaviour steeply decreased, though there is no evidence to back this boasting. It was apparently here that Thomas Jeffrey's troubles with alcohol began to become evident. He was stripped of his position after drunkenly attempting to stab the chief constable, who had busted him breaking through the wall of the barracks with a pickaxe. He was sentenced to 12 months at Macquarie Harbour Penal Station for this crime, but was somehow sent to labour in the Georgetown barracks again, likely because of his size and strength in the work party. In February 1825 he absconded from his work gang and was at large for a time, but was soon recaptured, given 50 lashes, and sentenced to harder forms of labour. In April that year, Jeffrey was transferred to Launceston, where he became the watchhouse keeper and flagellator. The flagellator was considered one of the most despised men in the convict world. Thomas acted as a torturer to other inmates, inflicting as much pain and injury as he could muster. Many convicts viewed this job as a betrayal to the convict class, because it meant that the criminal had essentially joined with the oppressors to break and brutalise their peers. Jeffrey's alcoholism contributed to some of the worst floggings put into print. Newspaper reports of the day complained that under Jeffrey's enforcement, they saw 2 men cut around the throat, under the armpits and ribs of the right side during a 20-minute bout of 50 lashes. The local clergyman claimed he could not sleep that night because of the cries of the sufferers. Another correspondent claimed to have seen Thomas Jeffrey put a convict's feet into hot ashes while he was being flogged until his toes were consumed by the fiery remnants. He was also fined in August for falsely imprisoning and assaulting Elizabeth Jessup, allegedly throwing her into a cell at the watch house and raping her through the night. He was later fined for taking a woman out of the watch house, although this seems to have been a consensual situation. In December 1825, joined by John Perry, William Russell and James Hopkins, Thomas Jeffrey escaped from the Launceston watch house. The prison authorities had suspected this and lay in wait as the gang headed out. When they were fired upon by a guard, Jeffrey dropped everything he was carrying and he and his new gang bolted into the bush. Thomas Jeffrey was now on the run. The gang first robbed the hut of a man named Smith in Breadalbane, around 13 kilometres south of Launceston, taking flour, a musket and powdered ammunition. They continued towards the South Esk River, robbing huts as they went, including Police Captain Andrew Barclay. They are said to express at this time a desire to join famous bushranger Matthew Brady's gang, to no avail. Hopkins parted from the gang at this point for unknown reasons. In mid-December 1825, the gang stayed for 10 days at James Sutherland's farm, Rothbury, near Campbelltown. On Christmas Day, there was a shootout and one of Sutherland's men was killed. The gang raided a nearby hut and then continued into the bush. Having killed for the first time, the hunt from Jeffrey and his people intensified. Each man knew that they would go to the gallows if caught. They were told by one of Sutherland's men that 200 or 300 men were probably on the lookout for them, and this panicked them enough to go up the river back towards Launceston. On the 31st of December, they raided John Tibbs' farm in Mowbray Hill, where several people were taken prisoner, including John Tibbs' wife Elizabeth and her infant baby. The bushrangers then robbed the house. They then took their prisoners into the bush, carrying the plunder. The group was split up, with Perry and Russell taking one group and Jeffrey with the remainder. Tensions grew as the groups were marched through the bush, resulting in Russell shooting the stockkeeper, Basham, dead. Perry then shot John Tibbs in the neck. Despite being badly wounded, Tibbs managed to escape and raise an alarm in Launceston. Basham lay where he was shot, alive, for a week, but would later die from his wounds. Tibbs later said that the entire town headed out to capture Jeffrey and his gang. The two groups rejoined and continued to head north. During the trek, Elizabeth Tibbs' crying was starting to frustrate Thomas Jeffrey. She claimed that she could not carry the baby in this state. Jeffreys took the infant from her, walked with a compatriot into the bushes, and swung the baby against a tree, killing him immediately. Jeffrey and Russell came back to the group and told the distraught mother they had sent the child to a man named Mr. Barnard to look after. After camping for the night, where Elizabeth Tibbs were raped, the prisoners were released in the morning. The remains of the baby were found more than a week later, with both legs and an arm having been eaten by animals. Soon after, a reward of £200 or a free pardon was issued for Jeffrey and company. Thomas had taken to calling himself Captain Jeffrey, wearing a kangaroo skin cap, a red waistcoat and a long black overcoat. It's not exactly the best uniform for a hot Tasmanian summer. The gang's next robbery was committed near Georgetown, followed by several days of walking in the bush with captives. On the 11th of January 1826, the gang encountered Constable Magnus Bakey, who was robbed and ordered to guide them through the bush. When Jeffrey became convinced that the constable was trying to steer them into the path of a search party, he executed Bakey by shooting him. They set their other captives free and continued into the bush, where they ran out of food and became lost. Desperate, the three tossed a coin to see who would be eaten. Thinking the whole thing a joke, Edward Russell laughed with the man about losing, and then he went to sleep. Thomas Jeffrey then shot the sleeping Russell in the head, cutting his thighs as steaks, and the two remaining members ate their comrade's flesh. Several days had passed between Bakey's murder and when Jeffrey and Perry re-emerged near Launceston at a farm where they found provisions and slaughtered 2 sheep for their meat. Not wanting to waste anything, Jeffrey and Perry ate the remaining steaks made from Edward Russell with fried mutton. Along the next part of the journey, Thomas Jeffrey encountered fellow bushranger Matthew Brady and once again sought to join his gang. Brady, known by then to many as Gentleman Brady, was well known as staunchly chivalrous operator who refused to rob or harm women, and he was polite to his victims. Jeffrey's monstrous behaviour, particularly towards women, was unacceptable to Brady, and Jeffrey was left on his own. Around this time, the gang's departed 4th member, Hopkins, was captured by the grandmother of the murdered baby. She managed to stab him with a fork before his capture. Good on you, love. On the 22nd of January, search parties went out looking for Perry and Jeffrey. While one party was at breakfast at a farm near Evandale, a First Nations boy named William, who'd been recruited as a tracker, pointed out Jeffrey to the group. The party overwhelmed Jeffrey and he surrendered, still with around 5 pounds of Edward Russell's flesh in his knapsack. Thomas Jeffrey had been captured by Batman. No, of course not that Batman. In fact, the famous Australian John Batman, who later committed multiple mass killings of First Nations people, as well as leading an expedition which explored the Port Phillip area on the Australian mainland with the goal of establishing a new settlement. In 1835, John Batman supposedly negotiated a treaty with First Nations people in Port Phillip, offering them tools, blankets and food in exchange for thousands of hectares of land, although this is disputed by First Nations ancestors. And where Port Phillip is now Melbourne. The creek where Thomas Jeffrey, the so-called monster, was taken was later renamed Jeffrey Creek and ran under what is now known as Logan Road near Evandale in Tasmania. Of course, the creek has long since dried up. The successful posse took Jeffrey back to Launceston, where crowds tried to attack the wagon. Jeffrey himself was lucky not to be lynched by the angry mob. He was then lodged in the old Launceston jail, where once again he willingly turned informant, telling the authorities all he knew of the locations, movements and habits of other bushrangers. Hearing of this, Matthew Brady had to be argued out of leading his gang into a frontal assault on the Launceston lockup, freeing all of the prisoners, dragging Jeffrey out and flogging him to death. Perry remained on the run until the end of the month, and he was captured near Launceston after being involved in the shooting of a man named McRae. After being given up by a spy who had tricked his way into the gang, Gentleman Matthew Brady was also captured in March by Batman. He and his associates were sent by ship to Hobart to stand trial with Jeffrey and Perry. Brady vociferously refused to share a cell with Jeffrey, threatening to decapitate him if he was not moved to a different cell. Jeffrey was then taken to trial. During the trial, Elizabeth Tibbs was brought to give evidence and identified Thomas, but upon seeing him in the dock, she collapsed in grief. Telling the story of the journey in which the monster had compelled her to take with him in the woods was plainly a painful addition to her suffering. Jeffrey, for his part, confessed to his life of crime and laid the blame for his behaviour on his alcoholism. Thomas Jeffrey was summarily found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. He was executed on the 4th of May 1826 at the Old Hobart Jail, on the 6-man scaffold. Among the others executed that day was Gentleman Matthew Brady, who complained about being executed in such dishonourable company, and Jeffrey's other gang member, John Perry. Thomas Jeffrey was buried in an unmarked grave in Hobart. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you watching the whole video. It was something different going back to Bushranger times. Join me next time as we trawl through another episode in the true crime history of Australia. If you've enjoyed this video, once again, please go ahead and shoot the like button with your trusty boomstick, stab that subscribe button until it bleeds, and make sure you also punch the notification bell in the face so you can be notified every time we release a new video. And remember, all of our episodes are released at the same time on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also find me on Instagram @somethingaboutmurder, and I respond to every message. So I hope to speak to you soon, and I hope you don't get murdered. Stay safe out there.